The most dangerous thing you can own late in a debt cycle is not a bad stock. It is a good-looking promise. If your wealth depends on a government, a bank, a pension system, a bond issuer, and a central bank all behaving honorably at the exact same moment, their incentives are breaking down, you are not secure. You are standing under a machine that is already warming up. I have spent my life thinking about capital allocation, and the older I get, the less patient I become with pretty labels. Safe, conservative, balanced income. Producing those labels seduce ordinary people into holding the wrong assets at the wrong stage of the cycle. And then they call the outcome bad luck. It is not bad luck. It is a transfer. That is the frame I want you to carry through every minute of this story. A transfer machine. Most people think a debt crisis destroys wealth. That is not precise enough. Wealth does not disappear first. It moves first. It moves from holders of paper claims to holders of real control. It moves from the highly leveraged to the lightly leveraged. It moves from the person who needs calm conditions to survive to the person who can survive disorder. By the time destruction becomes obvious, the transfer has already happened. If you do not understand the transfer machine, you will keep reaching for what feels stable while the machine is designed to punish exactly that instinct. The machine is older than Wall Street, older than the Federal Reserve, older than the United States. It has shown up in empires, republics, democracies, monarchies, and modern financial systems with better software and nicer language. The casing changes, the gears do not. The first gear is honest production. A country builds real wealth, people save. Institutions are trusted, debt exists, but it is proportionate. Currency is respected because it represents something anchored in output, restraint, and credibility. In that phase, the machine is quiet because there is little to transfer, the foundation is real. The second gear is overextension. Debt starts growing faster than productive capacity. Governments discover that borrowing is politically easier than discipline. Central banks discover that papering over stress is easier than letting the weak fail. Asset prices rise, citizens feel richer. People confuse upward prices with upward strength. This is where the machine becomes dangerous because it rewards the very behavior that will later be punished. The third gear is the squeeze. Debt servicing gets heavy. Inflation appears, trust frays, the public gets told contradictory stories, prices stay high enough to hurt, growth stays weak enough to disappoint. Politicians need easy answers, central bankers need credibility. They no longer fully possess. This is the stage where ordinary savers get trapped because the old rules still sound familiar, but the math underneath them has already changed. The fourth gear is the reset. Debts are inflated away, restructured, defaulted on, socially redistributed, or hidden beneath new rules. Wealth is repriced, old promises are honored nominally or broken politically, but in both cases purchasing power gets rearranged. The people holding the wrong assets spend years wondering what happened. The people who understood the transfer machine call it what it was. A cycle ending exactly the way cycles end. You can see the machine clearly if you stop listening to slogans and start reading history. Take Rome at the beginning. Roman money had substance. The denarius carried real silver. Rome had military dominance, trade, agriculture, engineering, and institutional force. Then spending outgrew restraint. The empire needed more than the treasury could honestly produce, so it did what governments do when appetite outruns discipline. It diluted the unit over time. The silver content was hacked down from something real to something insulting. What looked like money kept circulating, but the substance inside it had been bled out. Savers who had done everything the conventional world told them to do discovered that a lifetime of obedience could still end in confiscation. Not because a thief broke into the house, because the state quietly broke into the currency. The rich who shifted into land, hard goods, and enduring stores of value survived much better. The transfer did not feel philosophical to them. It felt physical. One class watched its claims weaken. Another class held things that did not need the emperor's honesty to retain value. Then look at Weimar Germany. Same machine, different costume, too much debt, too much pressure, too much printing. At first the problem seems manageable. Then it accelerates. Workers are paid, rush to spend, and still lose purchasing power by the hour. Savings accounts become jokes. Bond portfolios become ash. Treasury instruments do exactly what they promised in nominal terms and still fail completely in real terms. That is the part ordinary people miss. A contract can be honored and your wealth can still be murdered. The man holding marks was not protected because the number on the note existed. The person holding foreign currency, gold, productive land, or real industrial assets was playing a different game. One held symbols, the other held escape. Then Japan. People like to talk about Japan as though it were a local event. It was not. It was another lesson in what happens when paper wealth, cheap credit, and social confidence climb too far above economic gravity. Stocks screamed higher. Real estate became absurd. The land under the imperial palace was treated as though it were worth more than giant swaths of real productive territory elsewhere. That kind of pricing is not intelligence. It is late cycle theater. Then the rates moved, the spell broke, and an entire generation learned that a system-approved asset can still become a prison. The Nikkei did not rescue them. Real estate did not rescue them. Time did not rescue them quickly. A lost decade turned into two. People who had been told they were being prudent discovered they had simply bought at the wrong stage of the machine. Now bring your eyes back to the present. The United States had a real morning. Post-war America had industrial dominance, energy, manufacturing, military reach, a trusted dollar, and a monetary anchor the world could understand. That foundation was not fake, it was magnificent. But magnificent beginnings do not exempt a nation from arithmetic. The great shift came when restraint was severed from the unit itself. Once the dollar was no longer tied to gold, the flexibility felt liberating. It usually does at first. That is how the machine seduces people. A little more debt seems manageable, a little more currency creation seems temporary, a little more stimulus seems compassionate, and then the habit becomes the architecture. Federal debt that once sounded large in the billions became normal in the trillions. Then the trillions themselves became background noise. Around 2000, U.S. federal debt was roughly $5.7 trillion. But 2008 was around $10 trillion. By the time the pandemic arrived, it was around $23 trillion. Now it sits above $34 trillion, with projections that point far higher if the political structure remains what it is, which it almost certainly will. The annual deficit alone has been running near $2 trillion. The government is borrowing millions every minute. That is not a budgeting issue. That is the machine telling you the cycle is mature. Interest on the debt has pushed past the defense budget. Think about how extraordinary that is. The most militarily powerful government on earth is spending more servicing yesterday than defending today. A society can survive many things. It cannot survive forever when the cost of carrying old promises eats the muscle needed for everything else. And when the system reaches that point, there is one politically irresistible lever left: currency dilution. Not because officials enjoy evil, because the menu gets narrow, default is visible, austerity is hated, inflation is socially confusing enough to be chosen again and again. The printing press becomes the elegant lie. It lets everyone pretend the promise is still intact while the value inside the promise leaks out. That is why I keep telling you that the machine transfers wealth. It rarely opens by announcing, "We are here to erase purchasing power." It opens by saying, "We are preserving stability." You have already seen hints of the squeeze. Inflation surged hard in 2022. It cooled from the peak. But the structural drivers did not vanish. Higher rates can suppress symptoms for a while. But high rates inside a debt-saturated system create their own stress fractures across governments, corporations, commercial real estate, and households. That is what late cycle fragility looks like. Every policy cure is also a policy injury. Trust is also cracking in plain sight. Central banks around the world have been buying gold at the fastest pace since the late 1960s. China, Russia, Poland, India, Turkey, and others have been accumulating harder reserves and reducing dependence on the dollar system. That is not an academic footnote. That is stage 3 behavior. Smart institutions do not wait for the fire to be visible from the street. They leave when they smell wiring. Now, some people hear all this and say America is different. We have innovation. We have artificial intelligence. We have biotech. We have the deepest capital markets, all true. But mathematics does not salute the flag. Technology can create enormous wealth, I believe that. But new wealth from technology tends to concentrate first. It flows to owners, platforms, patents, chips, infrastructure, and the few businesses with true leverage. It does not automatically spread quickly enough to rescue a debt structure compounding across the entire sovereign balance sheet. Progress can be real and the debt trap can still be real. Those truths are not enemies. They can arrive together. So the question becomes practical. What specifically gets crushed when the transfer machine speeds up? The first thing is long-duration government bonds. Most people hear government bond and their brain turns off. They hear safe. They hear guaranteed. They hear backed by the full faith and credit of the state. That phrase has lulled generations into confusing legal certainty with economic safety. A long bond is a promise to receive fixed dollars over a very long stretch of time. If the dollars themselves are being diluted, the promise is not protecting you. It is trapping you in slow motion. Buy a 30-year bond at 4% and then live through a decade where inflation runs 6% or where the currency loses a huge chunk of real value across the life of that bond, and you have not preserved wealth. You have formalized decay. Every coupon payment arrives on time like a polite letter from a liar. This is what I call the promise trap. The more trustworthy the label sounds, the less carefully people inspect what is actually being promised. A long bond does not promise preserved purchasing power. It promises nominal repayment in a late debt cycle. Nominal repayment is often the prettiest way to lose. Duration is the handcuff inside the trap. A short instrument gives you optionality. A long instrument gives the system time to debase you. Time can be your best friend in a wonderful business. Time can be your executioner in a fixed paper claim. That does not mean you eliminate all liquidity or all government exposure. It means you stop pretending that lending long to an over-indebted sovereign at fixed rates is conservative wealth management. In this stage, it is delayed recognition. The second thing that gets crushed is passive cash held as a long horizon strategy. Now be careful, liquidity matters. I like cash when it gives me refusal power. I like cash when it lets me say no to stupidity and yes to bargains. I like cash when it keeps me from becoming a forced seller. But there is a difference between tactical liquidity and strategic idleness. People who leave large portions of their long-term net worth sitting in fiat cash because it feels safe are usually practicing what I call the quiet melt. Nothing explodes. No headline tells them they were robbed. The statement looks calm. The number looks stable. The damage happens in the background. The US dollar has lost the overwhelming majority of its purchasing power since the Federal Reserve era began. The pace of that erosion is not uniform. It speeds up when debt and monetary pressure get heavy. So when someone tells me they are protecting themselves by keeping large idle cash balances for 5 or 10 years inside a debasement-prone currency, I do not hear caution. I hear surrender disguised as discipline. Cash is useful because it buys time, not because it is a long-term store of real value. That distinction is everything. If you hold cash for flexibility, say that. Honestly, if you hold it because you think a static nominal figure means preserved wealth, the machine is already chewing on you. The third thing that gets crushed is overpriced domestic equities in companies with no pricing power. This is where people become tribal and stupid. They hear a warning about fragile equities and immediately swing into one of two foolish corners. Either they say all stocks are dangerous, or they say stocks always go up in the long run. Therefore, nothing matters. Both responses are lazy. I have spent my life preferring productive assets to sterile ones. I would still rather own a strong business than a pile of anxious currency. But not every equity is a strong business, and not every price is a sane price. In a late debt cycle, weak companies get attacked from every side at once. Their input costs rise. Their debt service costs rise, their customers weaken, their margins narrow. If they have no pricing power, they cannot push costs through. If they depended on cheap capital to sustain the illusion of quality, that illusion gets repossessed. This is the margin squeeze chamber. A lot of public companies look respectable only because the credit environment that fed them was generous. Once the generosity fades, you discover what the business really was. Thin margins, borrowed demand, financial cosmetics, hope sold at a premium multiple, and if you pay a high multiple for that kind of business, you are adding valuation risk to operating fragility. Now, the machine has two ways to hit you. Earnings disappoint, and the market is no longer willing to pay fantasy prices for mediocre economics. That is how wealth gets sawed in half, while the owner keeps telling himself he is a long-term investor. The equities I want near a reset are not the ones that need perfect conditions. I want businesses with low debt, real pricing power, necessary products or services, disciplined management, and revenue streams that do not collapse the moment consumers get squeezed. In an inflationary late cycle, the ability to pass through costs is not a luxury. It is oxygen. The fourth thing that gets crushed is residential real estate bought at peak credit expansion with heavy leverage in speculative markets. People become emotional here because homeownership is not just a financial category. It is identity aspiration, adulthood, status, family mythology, and political messaging, all wrapped into a single purchase. That is precisely why people lose so much money in it. The social story overwhelms the balance sheet. I am not telling you all real estate is bad. Real estate can be wonderful when purchased at the right price, with sensible financing, reasonable carrying costs, durable demand, and a yield or utility case that survives stress. But buying at stretched prices in markets inflated by cheap credit with maximum leverage, thin rental economics, and the assumption that real estate always goes up is not investing. It is borrowing to believe that is the concrete leverage trap. The walls are physical, but the logic is financial. The buyer thinks he owns stability. In reality, he owns a giant fixed obligation tethered to rates, taxes, maintenance, insurance, employment, and local demand. Japan showed how grotesque property valuations can unwind. The United States showed it again in 2008 through 2012. Today, mortgage rates are the highest they have been in more than 2 decades. Affordability has been crushed, and the exact credit conditions that inflated prices for years have reversed. If you are buying because you need a durable place to live, have conservative leverage, and can carry the asset through pain, that is one conversation. If you are buying because the previous generation told you any house at any price is a wealth machine, that is another conversation entirely. At the wrong point in the cycle, a house can behave like a long bond with termites. The fifth thing that gets crushed is lifestyle consumption disguised as investment. This one cuts deepest because it attacks the outer scorecard. Expensive cars bought on credit designer, goods on installment plans, luxury renovations justified as adding value, vacations financed off variable rate credit lines, consumption wearing the costume of sophistication. Late cycle households tell the same lie in 100 accents. They say, "I deserve this now because my income will keep rising." That sentence is how future freedom gets sold for present applause. I call this lifestyle leverage. It is not just debt. It is debt attached to identity. That makes it harder to reverse because the buyer is no longer defending an object. He is defending a self-image. Consumer debt in the United States is above $17 trillion, including mortgages. Credit card delinquencies have been rising at the fastest pace since about 2010. The savings rate has collapsed. In plain English, people are financing comfort at the exact moment the environment is becoming least forgiving to debt. That is how ordinary families walk into stage 3, carrying dynamite, and call it normal life. And here is the brutal truth. The great wealth transfer does not only happen from one country to another or from one currency block to another. It happens inside neighborhoods, inside professions, inside families. Two households can live on the same street, earn similar incomes, and end the decade in completely different universes. One optimized for display. The other optimized for durability. One bought status, the other bought optionality. One became a foreseller, the other became a buyer. That is how the machine actually feels on the ground. Now let me tell you what matters more than all the scary language. What do you do first? Stop measuring your world in nominal returns and start measuring it in preserved purchasing power. That single shift cleans up a shocking amount of stupidity. A 7% nominal return in a world of 6%, real inflation is not success. It is a comfortable illusion, a fixed income stream that looks stable while healthcare, housing, education, and food climb around it is not protection. It is sedation. The survivors of ugly monetary periods learn to think this way whether they wanted to or not. They stop asking, "What is the number?" and start asking, "What can the number still buy?" The first question flatters the ego. The second question protects the family. Second, reduce leverage on everything that does not create durable productive value. A clean balance sheet is not flashy, but in reset periods it becomes a superpower. The person with low debt has time, the person with high debt has deadlines, markets punish deadlines. I have always liked having the ability to sit still while others are forced to do something foolish. That ability does not come from brilliance. It comes from structure. If your monthly life is so tight that a rate shock, a job interruption, or a market drawdown instantly changes your behavior, you are not investing from strength, you are negotiating with gravity. Third, distinguish between liquidity, resilience, and return. Do not use one bucket to do all three jobs. You need some liquid capital, because life is uncertain and markets misprice things. You need some resilience in assets that do not depend entirely on the honesty of a weakening currency regime. And you need ownership in productive assets that can grow purchasing power across time. That is why thoughtful investors in late cycles start rotating, not panicking. They look for hard assets. They look for businesses with pricing power. They look for exposure to regions or balance sheets less diseased than the most indebted core. They look for productive land in some cases. They look for gold or gold-related reserves in limited, purposeful ways, not because gold is magic, but because paper trust can fracture. I have spent my life preferring productive enterprises over inert metal, and I still do, but refusing to understand why hard assets rise in importance when faith in paper promises weakens is not discipline. It is dogma. The issue is not whether gold produces earnings. The issue is whether your portfolio is built entirely on promises from the very system under strain. Fourth, stop being patriotic with your balance sheet. I do not mean become hysterical or theatrical. I mean stop assuming that because you live in a country, every major risk to your wealth must also be denominated there. If your labor income is domestic, your home is domestic, your taxes are domestic, your pension exposure is domestic, your bonds are domestic, your cash is domestic, and your equity exposure is concentrated in a fragile slice of domestic financial assets, then you do not have a portfolio. You have a hostage situation. Diversification in a late cycle is not a cute optimization exercise. It is a recognition that no single monetary regime deserves all of your trust. Fifth, own businesses, not stories. A story is AI will save everything. A business is a company with pricing power, cash generation, disciplined capital allocation, and survival characteristics that do not require cheap money forever. A story is housing always goes up. A business is a property purchased with sober math, manageable debt, and utility or yield that survives stress. A story is luxury signals success. A business is a household balance sheet that quietly compounds because it is not bleeding from 10 vanity cuts. Once you start seeing the world this way, you notice how much of modern financial advice is really emotional anesthesia. Buy the index, blindly hold the bond allocation because it is standard, max out leverage because rates were low once. Upgrade the house because the school district sounds prestigious. Buy the car because you work hard. Keep the cash because the number makes you feel safe. All of it is built around reducing discomfort in the moment. Almost none of it is built around surviving a transfer machine. And let me say something unpopular. Ordinary people do not need exotic instruments to protect themselves. They usually do not need genius. They need honesty. You need to know what kind of risk you are actually carrying. If most of your net worth sits in long-duration paper claims, passive cash, weak businesses priced for optimism, highly leveraged housing, and lifestyle debt, then your risk is not hidden. It is simply unlabeled. You are long conventionality at the worst moment to worship conventionality. What I would rather see is boring strength. I would rather see short-term liquidity than long-term handcuffs. I would rather see low debt than impressive possessions. I would rather see a smaller house and a stronger balance sheet than a grander address and quiet panic. I would rather see ownership in a few understandable productive assets than endless exposure to financial products you cannot explain under stress. I would rather see some hard reserve outside the pure paper system than blind faith that every institution will coordinate perfectly when pressure rises. I would rather see a life designed to need less applause and tolerate more volatility. That is what preparedness looks like. It is not glamorous. It is not cinematic. It is not the adrenaline rush of a great market top. It is colder than that, more strategic than that, more adult than that. People always want the bell. They want the official declaration that the cycle has turned. They want permission from the television, the central banker, the bank advisor, or the neighbor who has been wrong for 15 years in a row but still sounds confident at cookouts. The transfer machine does not offer that courtesy. By the time the average person feels the reset clearly, the best exits are crowded, the repricing is underway, and the cost of flexibility has gone vertical. That is why I am hard on this subject, not because I enjoy fear. I despise fear used as entertainment, but I respect fear used as diagnosis. Fear can be clarifying if you force it to answer one question. What structure in my life would break first if the machine sped up? Would it be your mortgage? Would it be your job? Dependent spending level? Would it be your bond portfolio? Would it be your retirement assumptions? Would it be your need to sell assets at the worst moment? Would it be your refusal to own anything outside the paper system? Would it be your habit of confusing being busy with being prepared? That is the personal test. Not whether you can recite macro arguments, not whether you can argue about inflation online, not whether you can name historical analogies. The test is whether your balance sheet can survive a transfer. The worker who depends entirely on salary, holds most savings in decaying cash, rents out his future to car lenders and buys system-approved paper because it sounds safe, is playing defense with a cracked shield. The owner who builds optionality, limits leverage, holds liquidity for opportunity, owns productive assets with pricing power, and respects the difference between nominal comfort and real safety is playing a different game entirely. Salary versus equity, consumption versus freedom, status versus control, noise versus silence, fragility versus leverage. Those contrasts are not motivational poster slogans. They are operating differences that decide who gets harvested and who gets stronger when the machine tightens. I cannot promise you the month the reset arrives. Anyone who speaks with that sort of precision in macro matters is usually selling emotion. But I can tell you something more useful. We are not in the innocent phase. We are not at the clean beginning. The debt is already there. The debasement pressure is already there. Global diversification away from the pure dollar. Base system is already underway. Social fracture is already visible. The machine is not theoretical. It is running. And when a machine is already running, the intelligent question is not, do I have time to stay sloppy? The intelligent question is, which part of my life still assumes yesterday's rules? If you are holding long bonds because you were taught they are safe, challenge it. If you are holding huge passive cash balances because they soothe your nerves, challenge it. If you are loaded into expensive weak businesses because the last cycle rewarded them, challenge it. If you are levering into speculative housing because you are afraid of missing social status, challenge it. If you are financing appearances while calling yourself an investor, challenge it. The cycle does not care how sincere your misunderstanding was. I want to leave you with the simplest expression of the whole story. Late in a debt cycle, the world splits into two groups. One group owns promises from the stress machine. The other group owns some combination of resilience, optionality, and real productive control outside the weakest points of that machine. One group hopes the system will remain kind. The other group prepares for the system to remain mathematical. The first group keeps asking whether everything will be fine. The second group asks how to avoid becoming a donor in the transfer. That is the door in front of you. You can walk back toward the language that made you comfortable: safe bonds, plenty of cash, a bigger payment, a prettier life, domestic concentration, nominal gains, standard allocation. You can keep buying the labels and praying the substance returns to them, or you can walk through the harder door. Cut leverage, protect purchasing power, own strength, not stories. Keep liquidity for choice, not for illusion. Hold some assets that do not require perfect trust in a tired paper system. Build a life that can survive the machine instead of a life that only works when the machine is gentle. That is the choice. The transfer machine does not stop because you looked away. It does not pause because you were a loyal saver. It does not make exceptions for smart people with weak structure. And it never asks whether you are emotionally ready. It only asks one question. When the gears tighten, will your wealth still belong to you, or will it belong to the machine?